next panel is Friends of Ukraine Network. And in 2014, we established, the U.S. Ukraine Foundation established the Friends of Ukraine Network. It's a bipartisan coalition, former ambassadors to Ukraine, military experts, energy experts, economic experts, to create recommendations, create recommendations for our government every year except this one, because we've been doing it more rapidly. We had developed recommendations for U.S. assistance to Ukraine, published them, delivered them to everyone in Congress, to executive offices, and then went around and advocated for them, explaining why. This panel, members of the Friends of Ukraine National Security Task Force, are here this afternoon to talk about recommendations going forward for Ukraine. John Herbst, Ambassador Herbst, I don't think I need to do much of an introduction for him. A longtime career Foreign Service officer, ambassador, multiple countries, but most importantly for this discussion, ambassador to Ukraine, and now the head of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We will start with John.
Okay, Bob, thank you. And it's good to be here. I'm going to be a little bit broader than I normally am. So you hear something different from me, because I've been talking the same points for literally 8 years. I think it's going to be safe to say, you can't quite say it safely now, but historians within a few years will be saying that the high tide of modern authoritarianism came on February 4 of this year. That was the day that President Putin and President Xi met, and they issued a joint statement on cooperation between the two countries, which many analysts describe as unprecedented, and that's not necessarily wrong, although not quite adequate to describe it. And the two countries were perceived as representing a very, very serious challenge to the Western, not just in geographical terms, democratic world, which was seen as fading in terms of importance on the global scene. Within 20 days of that meeting, 4 days after the end of the Beijing Olympics, the large Kremlin invasion of Ukraine began. 73 years ago, was it 73 years ago? No, my math is bad. 83 years ago. No, 83. Yes, 83. Add 17 years to 22 and you get 39. On August 23, two large nations unveiled the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And 9 days after that, the Germans invaded Poland, the Soviets invaded Poland, and World War II began. Now, Putin is not Hitler. He's kind of a Hitler mini-me. But he is dangerous. And he represents a serious challenge to Western interests. And over the longer term, she represents a greater challenge because she has the advantage of a real economy under his feet, which Putin does not. But a funny thing happened on the way to Putin's major victory in Ukraine and large step towards undermining NATO. He ran into a people whose existence he denies. And we all know what happened on the outskirts of Kyiv, and even in a sense more amazingly on the outskirts of Kharkiv. And we all know what's happened since the Russian invasion, new invasion began. Senator Portman said something very important. which relates to American policy. He said that as we ask American taxpayers to dig more deeply into their pockets, someone needs to explain to them why they are doing that. And we haven't quite had that explanation, at least not from senior government officials. Ukraine, with substantial, what I call adequate support from the United States and the West, stopped Moscow's march on Kyiv, and as additional American support has been provided, began to roll it back. Not cheap if you look at the dollars that we're spending, but only not cheap if you don't understand the stakes. Mr. Putin's ambitions do not end on Ukraine's western borders. He has made clear multiple times, most notably in the 2 treaties that his minions sent to the United States and NATO last December, the quote-unquote terms for avoiding the big invasion which then took place. His terms are nothing less than the reassertion of substantial Kremlin political control over the entire territory of the former Soviet Union, and real influence as well within the area of the Warsaw Pact, which happens to include 6 or 7 more NATO nations beyond the 3 Baltic states. In other words, essentially the demise of NATO. The International Security Organization, which has guaranteed peace, security, and with it prosperity since the late 1940s. Needless to say, the United States has a vital interest in preventing that from happening. And the funny thing is, although it's not so funny, is that the smart way to do that, the economical way to do that, is to help Ukraine defeat Putin in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have no choice but to fight, because unless they fight, they cease to exist as an independent people. We all know the massive war crimes that are currently underway in Ukraine. We all know the statements coming from senior Russian figures and from the quote-unquote mainstream Russian media about the non-existence of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian language as a dialect of Russian, the need to de-Ukrainianize Ukraine, and to murder those people who within the boundaries of Ukraine consider themselves Ukrainian as opposed to somehow Russian. So Ukraine has no alternative to fighting. The smart play for the United States, given the danger that Putin represents to the United States, is to give Ukraine everything it needs in order to win. As Senator Portman said, although he did not provide the data, the expense in American lives and American money of having to defend Estonia or Lithuania or Latvia dwarf the tens of billions of dollars we are sending to Ukraine. For the life of me, I don't understand why the President of the United States cannot state that publicly, and why his Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, his National Security Advisor cannot echo that regularly. It was not apparent to the American people in the late 1940s that we should abandon our longtime policy of no entangling alliances. What you needed in the late 40s, and we had a group of people who collectively have been now called wise men, who laid out why this was absolutely essential for American security, American prosperity. To take control, actually that's too strong a word, to establish a major presence in Europe to ensure that the continent which created 2 world wars was at peace. And in fact, since NATO was established until Moscow marched into Ukraine in August of 2014, they had sent their minions there prior to that. Of course, they marched into Crimea in February of 2014, but then began the hot war in Donbass or rather the major intervention in the hot war in Donbass in August, when their side began to lose, NATO is absolutely essential for American security, for peace for America, and for American prosperity. If the administration were willing to say this as clearly as I just said it to you, from the top and repeatedly, the already substantial support you see among the American people for our aid to Ukraine would grow, instead of diminishing, as it is in at least one part of our political spectrum. The knuckleheads, and I use that term precisely, who argue that we have no interest in this war in Ukraine, don't understand what American security requires. I don't have any doubt, in fact, I know for a fact, that Republican leadership in the Senate would be only too happy to say such things publicly in coordination with the White House. It would be a very good thing if the president were to take this up. The amount of assistance that we are providing, the administration is providing, is substantial, and they deserve credit for that. And that's why I call their policy adequate. It has prevented Moscow from winning, and over time, it may lead to Moscow's defeat. But if we laid out the reason for our intervention, our support, and if we were bolder in what we did across the board, that defeat for the Kremlin would come sooner. And I don't want to go into detail because we've got a really strong panel to talk about the constituent elements of that. But what that means in two sentences are: one, more advanced weapons, so the Ukrainian counteroffensive will succeed faster, tougher sanctions, and raising the pressure on Moscow, not just economically and militarily, but politically and legally/morally. Now, one of the joys of my life is paying attention to mainstream Russian media. And that adjective is both precise and bizarre. It's precise because it reflects what's going on in the major outlets in Russia. It's bizarre because what's going on there is so extreme, which of course also makes it interesting. And the amazing thing we're seeing there lately, which speaks to the success we're having, even though we're not doing enough, and success of Ukrainian courage and ingenuity on the battlefield. You have the premier hawkish, actually it's quite worse than hawkish, chauvinist talking heads saying, gee, Russian leaders are afraid of The Hague. Or, gee, when we fail, everyone's going to be at fault. And these are the guys who, and when they're not saying this stuff, are saying, let's nuke Ukraine. Actually, let's not nuke Ukraine. Let's send our special tsunami bomb to send a tidal wave, 500-foot tidal wave to England. So we are clearly shaking the bad guys. Since we all understand the risk of this lingering in terms of economic damage, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe and the United States, and the time that gives Putin to play for wedges within the alliance, every fiber of any analyst being should be saying, let's end this now, which means a stronger policy, recognizing that Putin's is on his heels, and talk, among other things, of a ceasefire now is simply a major gift to Hitler's mini-me. Thank you.
Next panelist is Debra Cagan. Debra is currently a distinguished energy fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network. Trying to go beyond that on a resume, it gets confusing unless I simply say she has held senior diplomatic and other positions at the Department of State and the Department of Defense. And every time I'm in some group, somebody I would have no idea would know Debra, a general, a former whatever, turn around and they're hugging her. She's been everywhere doing everything. Debra Cagan.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, but after John's opening, I'm not sure I have anything left to say here. So I want to go back to what our elected officials said earlier today. I think all very compelling, but I want to do. Thank you. I wanted to go a little further back to what Senator Coons said at Halifax. He made a very poignant remark in his discussions, and it was about, I'm going to paraphrase here, where he said, you have to defeat Russia now because the United States was formed, we won the Revolutionary War, and 20 years later, Great Britain invaded again. And I thought, what a great comment, because that kind of wraps up all of this nonsense of negotiations and it's okay because Russia won't do this again. They've learned their lesson. They're going to lick their wounds and go home. And so I really appreciated the statements he made at Halifax because I thought it made some very poignant and real for Americans of what this means. The second thing that came out of Halifax was the head of the NATO Military Committee, the Dutch admiral, who very poignantly said that we have not done a good job at defending our own alliance. We have done everything wrong because we allowed our parliaments and others to have ethical considerations about never funding the military, because funding the military was bad. And it got so bad, and he didn't talk about this, but I will. It got so bad that I won't say which ally, but one of our allies didn't even have ample guns to do a war game, and they ended up using broomsticks instead of guns. Another of our allies, or soon-to-be allies, had bought into the peace dividend post-Cold War so extremely that when the Russians started playing footsies on their border, they had to go take military equipment out of their museum where they had put everything on display to use to defend their own territory. So the first statement that I would make is NATO and countries who are supplying equipment and weaponry to Ukraine are not having shortfalls because of Ukraine. The emperor has no clothes because it didn't do a very good job of understanding what safety and security of the West and Western democratic institutions meant. And it bought into a false narrative of a peace dividend as if everyone was going to go around the table and sing Kumbaya and strum their guitars and say, give peace a chance and everything's wonderful. So what Ukraine has done is put in a very sharp focus is our own deficiencies for how we looked at everything from funding our own military equipment and defense equipment to contracting processes to how we set up our 5-year plans that go into the National Defense Authorization Acts and everything else. And it also said that after 22 years of fighting counterinsurgencies, and depending on what we called air superiority, where we have enough aircraft to control the skies, and therefore we don't need to make a lot of layered air defense anymore. It all of a sudden, one day you wake up and you go, well, we don't always control those skies. So what are you going to do when you don't control the skies? And all of a sudden you're looking at Ukraine and everything's getting bombarded. And it's not that allies aren't willing to give this equipment to Ukraine, but they only have so much of it because they didn't think they'd ever have to use it. So for example, some of the equipment that is going to Ukraine it is quite old. And it was not, some of the air defense equipment was not capable of hitting a ballistic missile. It was built in an age of where you were looking at some rocket. And so that equipment has to be upgraded. It was sitting in storage. So the Hawks that the US was talking about giving, and I know Peter's going to get to more of this, but they were sitting in storage. They weren't upgraded. The reason why it's going to take some time to get them there is You don't want to send something to the region that isn't going to defend against the ballistic missiles that are coming in there, or even against the more sophisticated drones with the weapons technology that they have. So I think I'm not going to get into everything that John said, but he's right. We don't do a very good job of convincing our publics that in the long run, what we're talking about Ukraine, even though it sounds like a lot of money, is what we at the State Department used to say about the Pentagon budget. For the Pentagon, this is couch change. It's what falls out of your pockets and you look it up in the cushions. And I remember having these fights with the Pentagon when I was at State Department saying, come on, this is couch change for you guys. This is our budget for a year, for us. And what it comes down to is it is couch change to do this, but the cost savings to the American public, and I'm just going to be brutal about just the money issue here, is enormous. So for example, instead of spending money on a weapons program where you're sort of guessing whether what you're putting all these billions toward is actually going to work, and then finding 3 years into the 5-year plan that it's really not going to suffice, there is a real battle space going on in Ukraine where these weapons are being tested, and we know right away what succeeds and what fails. You don't have that out at Fort Huachuca. You don't have that in the middle of the Nevada desert. You don't have that at Fort Ord or Fort Hood, because you don't have that same sort of testing and evaluation going on. So purely just from a financial standpoint, the amount of money on R&D that the taxpayer is saving, that instead of like trying and throwing, let's see what sticks to the wall and see if it's there, that amount of money that you're saving is huge. So the Commandant of the Marine Corps had been pushing for some very modern ways of looking at highly mobile warfare. And part of his plan, which he then went forward with, was to get rid of 3 heavy armor brigades. And he got rid of them. And he had a lot of pushback when he first came up with this. But after Ukraine, remember what happened with the tanks sitting there mired, he didn't get as much pushback. They said, oh, you have a point here. You're right. And Ukraine gave him and a lot of the other service chiefs vindication for their look at the modern world. For instead of looking at fighting yesterday's war, is how are you going to fight the war of the future? Another point on this. We've heard endlessly that the United States and its allies can't afford to help Ukraine defeat Russia because it's leaving its flanks in the Indo-Pacific open to China and other malign actors. It is beyond my comprehension that the world's greatest superpower cannot walk and chew gum at the same time. And I find it ridiculous when I hear these arguments that you cannot face in the Pacific what you're doing transatlantically. And in a couple of examples from this in terms of lessons learned from Ukraine. We did not deploy HIMARS as a rule of thumb in exercises in the Pacific until this year. And in, I believe it was Malaysia, we deployed HIMARS in defensive airfields because maybe this will work. So now American companies are getting huge orders for HIMARS, and related ammunition for this, because all of a sudden this has great efficacy for whatever you're going to do vis-a-vis China in terms of protecting airfields, port facilities, and the like in the Pacific. So and these are not the sort of lessons learned that you sit there 6 months after something happened in Afghanistan and realize, oh, I made the mistake. These are lessons learned that can be turned around in 24 hours. That if you do this weapon with this weapon in this kind of environment, it doesn't work. And so instead of waiting for this long test period, you figure it out right away. It's dynamic, you change it on a pace that we've not seen before. And so it allows you to do military planning. And what I mean by this is I talk about the whole battle space, not the battlefield. So that means also cyber and psyops and everything else. So the lessons they're learning from Ukraine is, oh, we can use this weapon this way because we saw it this way. We didn't do a lot. We sort of understood counter drone technology. We understood some of this stuff, but oh, here's what happens when someone does wave after wave and there's no break. Or we're also finding that some of our equipment has planned obsolescence because you have spare parts. Not since Korea has the United States actually fought a type of ground war that had the kind of expenditure rates of ammunition as what's being done in Ukraine. And so what we're finding is, okay, in the future, when we build these systems, how do we keep the tubes from melting down? How do we keep accuracy and targeting and denial still working as we beat the heck out of this equipment and realize that replacement is going to happen much, much more quickly. And some have argued that we haven't seen anything like this since, since Normandy. And I think we saw some of this in Korea. So all of this needs to come into play when you talk about lessons learned. And why is this important going forward? Because when I hear the arguments that the taxpayers shouldn't be funding this because we have high inflation and everything else. Absolutely, we have high inflation and everything else. But funding this now, I'm not a math genius, so I can't give you the numbers, but I would bet that funding this now is going to result in an enormous amount of cost savings for defense budgets going forward. Another thing that we're looking at now is, and I'm looking at some of the Hill staff that's still here, is the multi-year commitments working with defense industry and how much that saves, because the cost of closing down a production line and then restarting it is huge. And we're seeing that now. If you have orders coming out on a routine basis, you will start to see these multi-year orders, which then lowers the price of the equipment and lowers the price to the US taxpayer as well. So there's a lot of things coming out of Ukraine that are fundamentally changing the way we look at warfare. One last piece I'll throw out here is, which I find really interesting. A number of NATO countries who have literally emptied their stocks of everything to help Ukraine. And there are NATO countries, and one could argue that we're seeing a level of burden sharing by NATO that we've not seen in 40 years. They are now revamping their entire military. Where do we go from here? What does this modern military look at? The United States is looking at moving away from brigade combat teams, which were the rage for 22 years. Going back to division and corps levels, and understanding that you have to have command and control of entire battle space just because of what's happening in Ukraine and how you have to go forward. NATO countries, I'm sort of nerdy and I read the defense press all the time. And you look at this and they are looking at revamping their entire military systems and saying, this is maybe what we have to address. It's just not an issue of what our defense industry can produce, but it's an issue of how best to address the threats of the future and do it in a way where we have integrated, interoperable forces that can control the battle space. And one last point on this, another lesson learned for NATO. What I think happened in Poland was Ukraine shooting down a Russian missile, and then the detritus fell in Poland and unfortunately killed people. And I think that's what a lot of people are saying. Having said that, it was a second instance where something from this war flew over NATO airspace and crashed. And the first was the one in Croatia that spent 20 minutes in the air in Romania. Not a single early warning radar, not a single air defense system picked these up before they hit. So if I'm NATO and I'm on the military committee and I'm looking at this and I'm going, this is a failure of our vaunted early warning and air defense system that we didn't pick these up. And this is something else that is a critical lesson, especially for those countries that live in that pretty lousy neighborhood. I'm not talking the ones who get to live west of Berlin, but the ones east, have now understood that we had our air policing, we had all this other stuff, and it looked great on paper, but we're not on paper anymore. We now have to put real things to real forces to how we're going to do this going forward. And we've learned this all because of Ukraine. And I'll end it there.
Thank you, Deborah. Next on our panel is Ambassador Sandy Vershbow. Sandy, I mean, all these people have very long resumes and they're very impressive at each stage. But Sandy has been ambassador to NATO, ambassador to Russia, deputy secretary of NATO, official in our National Security Council, positions at state, and I'm anxious to hear what he has to say. Sandy.
Okay. Thanks very much, Bob. Thanks to my fellow panelists for a very bracing introduction. And I think it's certainly important that we do more to educate our publics about what is really at stake in Ukraine. We like to talk about the rules-based international order, but it's true that the international order that we've relied upon since World War II, and particularly since the end of the Cold War, is now being directly challenged by Putin. And strategic stability is also at risk as Putin engages in nuclear saber rattling, threatening to break the nuclear taboo that's been in effect since 1945. So lots at stake going beyond the central issue, which is Ukraine's survival as an independent state. So U.S. interests are very much on the line, and we have to make sure our people fully understand what is at stake. Given the stakes, just defending against Russia isn't enough. We have to defeat Russia. We have to commit unambiguously to Ukrainian victory. And I worry sometimes that we're not 100% there on being in it to win it without any reservations. It's understandable. We don't want to get into a direct conflict with Russia. We certainly don't want to provoke a nuclear exchange. But I think there's a lot more that we can do in our support for Ukraine without running those risks and put an end to this conflict once and for all. We certainly don't want to normalize Russian behavior to change borders by force. We don't want others like China to think that that's okay in the modern world. And we don't want nuclear coercion to become an everyday occurrence. So only further weaken the non-proliferation regime and undermine the strategic stability. Now, Bob's asked me to talk about diplomacy and the recent calls for negotiations. I would say, diplomacy may have its place at some point in bringing this conflict to an end. I think it won't, however, be really opportune until Putin is facing certain defeat. And that means we're far from the point where diplomacy is, I think, is really relevant. Despite the huge losses that Russia has suffered on the battlefield, and the increasing impact of sanctions on the Russian economy, Putin has not altered his war aims really one iota. He's still talking about subjugating Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine, which means regime change, which means erasing the Ukrainian national identity. He even wants to annex territories he doesn't even control. So we're far from the point where Putin is showing any indication of being ready to negotiate seriously. That means diplomacy right now would be at best a distraction, but at worst it could be a trap because it could put us on a slippery slope to Russian proposals, being forced to accept Russian proposals for a ceasefire, which sounds like a reasonable way to end the killing, but a ceasefire could quickly turn itself into another frozen conflict and enable Putin, despite being on the back foot on the battlefield, enabling Putin to freeze Russia's gains and buying some breathing space with which to rearm and regroup and come back again with a fourth invasion within a couple of years. So what that means, in my view, is we have to recommit ourselves to doing not only whatever it takes for as long as it takes. I think, as John was saying, we need to accelerate as much as we can, push for Ukrainian victory as best we can. And that means, I think, overcoming the excessive caution that sometimes characterizes our decisions when it comes to specific weapon systems. And Peter's going to talk more about what specifically the Ukrainians need to win. But I think this concern about escalation, as I said, is, it's understandable. But right now, the fact of the matter is it's Russia that's doing most of the escalating with its brutal and barbaric attacks on civilian infrastructure, its terrorization of the civilian population. Russia clearly is feeling undeterred, and I think we need to look at some of the decisions we've made to withhold certain capabilities and provide the Ukrainians with what additional capabilities need to achieve victory and achieve it as quickly as possible. A lot has been discussed about the so-called ATACMS munition that could go on to the HIMARS system. Peter can discuss this in greater detail. But I think that denying the Russians a sanctuary, whether it's in Crimea or in contiguous areas of Russia from which they can carry out their attacks on the infrastructure system, is long overdue. One thing that I've puzzled over is, why are there so many calls for negotiations now? I think there's a lot of false premises, which may be well intended, but I think hard to accept when you subject them to scrutiny. One false premise is the fact that is the idea that the Ukrainians, even with continued U.S. and Allied support, will never have enough capability to take back much more territory than they've captured thus far, and certainly not Crimea, and that sooner or later Kiev will need to trade land for peace. And the trying diplomacy now could save lives. This is the view of some of the realists. Another false premise is that Russia is looking for a face-saving solution, that the war has been a military debacle, it's been ruinous to the Russian economy, and that if given a serious proposal, Russia will negotiate in good faith and be prepared to live in peace alongside an independent Ukraine. That's, I think, is so ridiculous that it's hard to dignify, but I think that's what some of the realists would have you believe. And part of this argument is, and this may have some validity, is that Crimea is existential for Putin, that he would be deposed if he lost Crimea and could be tempted to use nuclear weapons if Russian control over Crimea were at risk. And a different argument is that we need to accept that we don't have enough of a stake in this conflict to justify supporting Ukraine's demands to recover 100% of their lost territory, and that we should therefore persuade Kiev to accept territorial compromises lest they squander U.S. and Allied support. Anyway, I won't debunk these in detail, but I think on the capabilities, it's obvious that the Ukrainians have surpassed our expectations at every point in this war. And if they're prepared to continue to do the fighting, we should continue to provide them all the support that they need to retake the territory, at least the territory seized since February 24th, where they're 50% of the way there. But if they can do it, to contest Russian control over Crimea as well. On face-saving outcomes for Putin, as I said, Putin has shown no sign of a readiness to end the war on terms other than Ukraine's complete and total capitulation. He still labels President Zelensky a Nazi, and he calls for the denazification, or now even the desatanization of Ukraine, not exactly the language of peaceful coexistence. And even if Putin were looking for an off-ramp, which I don't think he is, Given all the evidence of war crimes and acts of genocide, why should Ukraine be forced to subject millions of its citizens to brutal repression and forced Russification in order to help Mr. Putin save face? The fact is that when it comes to lowering the bar in terms of what are Ukraine's war aims, fact is that any agreements that would cede sovereignty over Ukrainian territory to Russia would be ratifying Moscow's violation of one of the fundamental pillars of the international order. It would reward aggression and send the message to other revisionist leaders that changing borders by force is now legitimate. So that's certainly the message Xi Jinping would get on Taiwan if we allow Putin to keep some of his winnings. So my view is we should support Ukrainian demands to recover all the occupied territories. And if some issues are too hard to settle, we should maintain a non-recognition policy. We shouldn't codify even limited territorial changes. Non-recognition work for the Baltic states, and it's appropriate in the Ukrainian case as well. But the key is we have to do everything that we can do to help the Ukrainians win this war. A halfway solution is ultimately a victory for Putin. And we have to make sure our publics understand what's at stake so that Ukraine fatigue doesn't get the better of us. Thanks.
Thank you. Peter, every one of our speakers so far has deferred to you a little bit, so you're kind of set up down there.
Yeah.
Peter has had a number of critical and important positions inside our government. He is now a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he's written some great stuff lately. I recommend you just Google and find it. But Peter, take it away.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks to my fellow panelists for having me, and to all of you for enduring late into the afternoon. I think this is the part where I say I'm not a military technical analyst, but I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night, and hope that you all buy it. Maybe I'll just start by picking up a theme that Sandy just ended on, which is why the tempo and commentary is picked up, examining war termination, potentially ceasefire, and the scope and scale of a future Ukraine beyond the war. And I suspect it is connected to the liberation of Kherson. Once the Russians withdrew from the western bank of Kherson, I believe, and this is kind of my intuition and inclination talking to officials in the United States, civil society, but also in parts of Western and Southern Europe, many of them view the Dnieper as sort of a natural barrier between what they would consider to be vital Ukraine west of the river and Russian occupied territories on the other half of the Ukrainian Dnieper border. Needless to say, this violates the spirit, if not the letter, of nothing about the Ukrainians without the Ukrainians, and I think it's a dangerous fallacy. I'll just continue with Kherson. Right before we walked in here, the president held a press conference with President Macron of France, in which he stated outright that he sees no indications that Vladimir Putin is prepared to wind down the war. He was being asked about any diplomatic contacts or outreach to the Kremlin, and that was his answer. And I think that tees up nicely what I experienced in my last trip to Ukraine 2 weeks ago. The Russian withdrawal from Kherson was unlike around Kharkiv, not a rout, but a relatively orderly withdrawal, which is to say that those troops have largely reinforced positions around Zaporizhia and elsewhere in the Donbass. So while there's a lot of talk about the culmination of Russian forces and their offensive operations, the Ukrainians are very worried that, and I haven't even used the word Bakhmut yet, that the Russians are still trying to pound away and move forward. Moreover, and this still I think stays a little bit in the political and economic realm, but in my talks with the Ukrainians, it's easy to forget until you, or easy to remember, I should say, until you speak with them, that the Russians occupy very valuable and important parts of Ukraine, just purely economically. Think of the Zaporizhia power plant, let alone, and Fred Cagan has written about this persuasively, the parts of Ukraine which Russia occupies include really valuable parts of the extractive industries connected, of course, to the port of Mariupol, that powered the Ukrainian economy before the full-scale operation began on February 24th. So, there's a lot to be said for keeping the Ukrainians in the fight and for supplying them to the extent we can. That is one theater, the Kherson front, having kind of evaporated or faded from people's minds, even though there's still barrages taking place across the river. But the south, I should say, in the east. But I'd like to draw your attention to just another area, which I think has gone a bit under-discussed. And one of my colleagues at Hudson Institute, Can Kasapoulou, he's a military analyst based in Istanbul, drew my attention to a recent deployment of 15 Tor M2 low and medium altitude missile defenses or air defenses that the Russians have deployed into Belarus. We've also seen a detachment of MiG-31 interceptors, potentially outfitted with Kinzhal missiles, these aeroballistic missiles. And General Rutsky, who is the Russian main operations director commander, recently traveled to Belarus to inspect some of the training that's taking place there, Russian reservists. To a person, from intelligence to military officials in Ukraine that I spoke to, raised the specter of a renewed Belarusian vector or front in the war. Now, I don't think the Russians are so foolish to think that, well, perhaps they are, but they're not necessarily going to try to take Kyiv again as they did in their thunder run through Holodomor, Bucha, Irpin, and down into Kyiv in late February all the way through March. But they could try to disrupt Western supply lines and this is clearly a main focus of the Russian war effort right now, damage and destroy critical infrastructure so as to essentially freeze the Ukrainians into surrender. So while there's a major threat that continues in daily fighting in the front, as we've come to understand it in the south and the east, the Belarus vector angle, I think, is worrying because it would force the Ukrainians to draw off, as mined as that border is, and as much as the territorial defense forces have improved since they were stood up in January, it would force them to draw off some of their elite forces from other parts of the country. And that, of course, alone might be a tactical victory or all that the Russians want to accomplish. This could all be a feint, who knows, but I think it's worth keeping our eyes on. So maybe to begin with my recommendations or my thinking about where the Ukrainians are and what they need, I would start with the Belarus angle. President Lukashenko oversees a country with a more robust civil society than, say, Russia. Belarus has traditionally been inward focused. It does not command much of a military. His internal repression apparatus is fairly formidable, as we've discovered over the past several years. But aside from some airborne troops, no one quakes in their boots when they hear about the Belarusian military. Given what happened to his foreign minister over the weekend, we don't know why he died, but Lukashenko thought it important enough to change out his cooks and his own personal security team. So it very well could have been a poisoning, and that may be the message that Lukashenko took away. You know, he really is caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, I doubt he wants to go to war in Ukraine, given his own tenuous hold and what I just described. On the other hand, he is, since the uprising in Belarus, essentially wholly owned by the Kremlin. So I think it would be worthwhile for the West to consider something like exercising along the Belarusian-Polish border, if only to give Lukashenko an argument to take to Putin that he faces a threat from the West, and so it's hard for him to commit to a war in Ukraine. At least thinking creatively about how to spare the Ukrainians this northern front. That has been, it's hard to stress how damaging this has been to the Ukrainians. The current hostile border they face extends from basically Maine to Fort Lauderdale. If Belarus weren't a part of that, you know, that would be much easier interior lines of communication, and the opening scenes of the war would have been fundamentally different. As for the remaining front lines and just the systems that the Ukrainians want, you know, let's just start with the main battle tank, which is, I think, something that they've really been eager to get. And their real target here is the Leopard 2, which is the German system. It's very prominent in Europe. There are thousands of them, by my count, around 2,000 spread across 13 European countries, which, and this is very important, Debra already hinted at this, a big spare parts market, because this war is so grinding that replacing parts and upkeep is very important. The Germans have essentially controlled end user agreements on these systems. And so when the Spanish, I think in late August, reportedly were prepared to offer the Leopards to the Ukrainians, the Germans vetoed this transfer. And the rationale that Berlin puts forward is we will not be first and only as part of a coalition. So again, here my recommendation to the United States would be the M1 Abrams is not really the target for the Ukrainians. And the M1 Abrams tends to be exported to other parts of the world, North Africa, the Middle East. But let's just give the Ukrainians 5 M1 Abrams. We can park them in front of the U.S. Embassy so the Americans know that they're not going into combat. And thereby, at least, the excuse for the German goes away that they are first and not part of a coalition. Even one M1 Abrams, very prominently festooned with ribbons and all the rest, delivered to the Ukrainians so that the argument goes away that that this will not work. Another potentially creative solution is the Ukrainians really want air power. And an argument early in the war has been that some of these programs would take too long to train the Ukrainians on. Some of them would take months. Well, here we are 8-9 months later. Had we begun early on in the war training them on some of these systems, by now they would be operational. So if we could start, say, an F-16 training program, it would not bear fruit until perhaps late or mid 2023, but eventually it would bear fruit. If the F-16 is objectionable to the Biden administration for the political reasons that my colleagues have already laid out, well, the Swedes just lost out on an F-35 contract to Finland, an F-16 contract to Bulgaria. Maybe the Saab 39 Gripen is an alternative system that could possibly be considered. This is not the ideal scenario for the Ukrainians, but beggars can't be choosers, so to speak. They would like to have an air system, and maybe that would be an alternative that we could go for. Having, as I mentioned, just returned from Ukraine 2 weeks ago, I am very appreciative of air defenses. I was there at the border when that SAM system dropped into Poland, if that's in fact what happened, and in Kyiv as air raid sirens went off. To the extent that we can push NASAMS and just missile defenses and drone defenses to Ukraine, I think that would be really important. And quite frankly, we don't have enough of these systems. Deb's already mentioned this. And a real problem for the United States becomes if, and I imagine Moscow is urging the Iranians to do this, they begin getting more aggressive in other parts of the world to spread us thin on our air defenses. We should make very clear via Brussels and our European allies that we're prepared to exercise snapback on the JCPOA, among other measures, if this sort of activity continues, or if it escalates in other parts of the world, because we just don't have enough systems and we're beginning to get stretched thin on all of this. In fact, I'm for snapback, period, but that's another discussion. One thing that's gone a little bit under discussed, but I got this from frontline sort of skirmishing troops in Ukraine, is 120 millimeter mortars. This is really for kind of close combat, not the long artillery stuff, but it's preferred for their lighter weight. I think this is something that we can do. And of course, because it is such an intensive war, the 150 millimeter howitzer, the replacement barrels, the shells, all the stuff the Ukrainians want. And then there are things like armored Humvees. Now, we have tons of these sitting around, warehoused in the United States. The German Schützenpanzermarder or the U.S. Bradley fighting vehicles, all of this would be hugely helpful for the infantry fighting vehicles front. But, you know, I've seen reports and heard anecdotal evidence of some Ukrainians using like Brinks trucks to drive around, like bank trucks, because they don't have some of these armored systems. It would be fantastic if some of these, which are sitting around warehoused at Army bases in the U.S., could make their way to Ukraine. You may have seen this week 16 United States senators on a bipartisan basis. I think Senator Ernst of Iowa organized it, but Senator Manchin is on the letter, perhaps others, urged the administration to provide unmanned aerial vehicles to the Ukrainians, in particular the advanced MQ-1 Gray Eagle. This would allow the Ukrainians to have ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. It will also allow them to strike behind Russian lines and really hit their supply depots, et cetera, perhaps break any Black Sea blockade that would come up again. I think this is a worthy consideration. And here, the objection from the administration, as I've understood it, has been perhaps in the back of their mind, it's political, but they say, and they've leaned on this, they're sensitive technologies to which the Pentagon objects. Well, from my conversations with members on Capitol Hill, there are ways around this. I don't think we can get into all of that here, but I think we need to be as creative as possible to push as much forward to them as we can. The ATACMS would similarly massively extend Ukraine's range. I mean, right now, the HIMARS outfitted with the sort of Gimler systems range about 70 or 80 kilometers. Deb, correct me if any of this is wrong, but the ATACMS can go to up to 300 kilometers. This would do huge damage, again, to logistics and supply, which has been a big factor in this war. And during this season that we're in right now, where tanks can do okay, tracked vehicles can move, but a lot of civilian cars, which the Russians are using for resupply, have to stay on roads because of the mud and so forth. In the Rasputitsa season, as it's known in Ukraine, it would be really useful to try to push back their logistics, push back their supply, and complicate all of this for them. I also noticed in Ukraine, meeting with some of their new soldiers, their new intelligence officials, all of this is being stood up in real time. A lot of creativity in, say, their SBU and other services. And there have to be ways for us to crash course some Western best practices, for example, to Ukrainian intelligence services on counterintelligence operations. We have a wonderful facility in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Bavaria called the United States Marshall Center for European Studies. They have traditionally really seen at the core of their mission training post-Soviet states in civ-mil relations, training mid-level officers. We should be building out and fielding crash courses to cycle through the Ukrainians as quickly as possible. They have taken the sort of captain's course that the U.S. Army has and reduced it dramatically for their new civilian, now military officers. I think we should be trying to do as much of this as possible. And to the extent that the EU and others are going to set up training missions in Poland for Ukrainians, the U.S. I think has to be a part of that for it to work effectively. I have other ideas too, but I just want to end on a slightly different note, and that is getting back to the politics and strategic concept. So I'm 39, turning 40 here shortly, and my entire adult life in the United States, we've just experienced basic strategic failure. I was in college when 9/11 took place. Thereafter, we had the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan began promisingly, but eventually it deteriorated, and we all saw the disaster unfold last year. The war in Iraq deteriorated relatively quickly. And in 2006 was bordering, if not altogether, in civil war. The pullout there did not succeed. We had ISIS return, Syria collapse, the refugee waves from Syria destabilized some of our closest European allies, a financial crisis to boot on top of all of that. And I could go on, leading to a pandemic. Here we have, for the first time in 20 to 25 years, accepting some of the very important things like NATO expansion in 2004, which I don't want to minimize or downplay. But here we have a strategic opportunity par excellence, and I think it does so much and would do so much for American morale to have a win on the board. It's not costing us an ounce of American blood. The American defense budget ranges in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually, basically to defer and defeat two major adversaries, the Russian army and the Chinese. And the Ukrainians, for pennies on the dollar, are doing it all for us. The Russian military is being crunched and destroyed in Ukraine. This to me is a no-brainer, and it just suggests to me, I swear, if we developed a cancer drug tomorrow, people would say, well, there's a downside to this as well. I just don't see it. And with that, I'll just turn it back to Bob.
Being old, I really like that young perspective. And
Well, I would just add to that, the Vietnam generation felt defeat in the mid-'70s, but 13 years later, victory in the Cold War. I'm still waiting on my victory, and I think this is the opportunity, to really take it to the Russians.
absolutely. And I'm going to ask for a lightning round from our panel, but it's come up a couple of places. I think everybody. One of our other Friends of Ukraine National Security Task Force members has made the point a number of times. When is the United States going to state clearly what its objective is in Ukraine? That goes to the point of what are we going to do, and are we committed to doing it? My comment. Lightning round will go the same order. John?
We're almost out of time. So just 2 points. In response to Bob's question, our answer should be to ensure a Ukrainian victory and a Putin defeat. We can quibble about the details, but that's the objective. And picking up on Peter's point, the problem, the point of reference for the scholars and others who are arguing against a strong policy to defeat Putin is, like many a general, they're fighting the last war. They have analogized, I should say, made an analogy of our failures in the Middle East with our efforts in Ukraine, not recognizing the significant differences in the situation, and that we have a credible partner in Ukraine who, in fact, is kicking the Russians' rear end without American troops. Ukraine will win this war if we provide the support that they need. That was not true in the greater Middle East, sadly.
Debra?
So I think we spend far too much time worrying about what happens to the almost vanquished and not enough time thinking about what to do about the victors. So we are hand-wringing just endlessly about what happens to poor Russia when and if Putin loses. And it's just not worth the time or the bandwidth to keep doing that and to keep throwing out terms like escalation. And what I like to say is preempting yourself from actually having a policy because you're so afraid. So I think we need to spend more time worrying, less time worrying about the vanquished. I think that the Russian people will survive. Putin goes away. It's a win-win for everyone. It's a win-win for the Russian people. That's okay. And we should stop worrying about that and worrying more about, as Peter put it, getting a victory for Ukraine, calling it a victory, stop talking about incremental successes, calling it a victory, and just move ahead. Embrace the change as leaders like Sandy did in the 90s when NATO enlargement happened, when 2+4 happened in Berlin and Germany was reunified. Embrace the change. Don't run away from it and be afraid of it.
I
Sandy?
agree with what John and Deborah have said. And I said earlier, we have to be unambiguous that a Ukrainian victory is the goal and stop being so shy about using that word. And I think we have to show that our commitment extends beyond the end of this war. I think a long-term commitment to Ukraine's defense and deterrence capability, its ability to not only to consolidate its independence and sovereignty and become a functioning democracy yet again, but to have sufficient support from its allies to deter Russia from thinking about invading again. And that I think needs to be part of the thinking about what kind of settlement might actually end this someday. It's not going to be a kind of a one-off. We can celebrate and go home. The Russians are not going to give up their revisionist agenda overnight. I mean, we can hope for regime change, but that doesn't mean we're going to have more cooperative Russian leaders for another couple of generations. So it still would be expensive, but it's a good investment. And I think ultimately it should lead to Ukrainian membership of NATO. We should get over our hang-ups about that as well. I'd like to see that happen even sooner rather than later, but certainly as part of a long-term security plan for Ukraine. Enough assistance that they can deter the Russians and become probably one of the most effective and capable NATO members that we've ever had.
Just to very quickly answer the question, I suspect our ambiguity in endorsing Ukrainian victory stems from the fact that we might not quite desire Ukrainian victory, but saying that is political suicide, given that Volodymyr Zelensky has been anointed as sort of the Churchill of our current day. And so I think there was a great cover in Bild magazine, the most read sort of almost call it sort of a broadsheet in Europe. It's a German news publication in which they asked and put the question to 3 or 4 ministers, do you believe in Ukrainian victory? That was essentially the question. And they all kind of worked their way around the question and essentially tried to settle on Ukraine must not be defeated. But of course, there's a difference between Ukraine not being defeated and Ukraine achieving victory. And in that space, I think, lives the difference between where the West or some Westerners might be comfortable and where the Ukrainians want to take it.
John?
Just to leave you with a thought to take out of here, and to convey to your senators and congressmen and your president, ask not what Putin can do to us, but what we can do to Putin.
I like that. Thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your contributions and your ongoing work.